That. Well, I'm Pastor Terrie, and this is.
My name is Ron, and we're the Fischers.
Yeah, we're the Fischers. Okay. And we are the prayer pastors at our church here at River City. And I'm nervous. Ron and I have never done this before. We've never tag team a message, and so I'm asking for oodles of grace to come our way so we can get across what we want to say. The beginning of our story is, we're going to talk about in the beginning. Ron?
Well, in order to get to where we are today, there has to be a beginning. As in any relationship, there's a beginning and where we're at the present time. And I chose to go back and give just a quick, I'm trying to give a quick testimony. As we were preparing for this, I said, you know, Terrie, you're able to get the point across with cliff notes. And when I try to tell my story, it tends to be a novel. And I go on rambling a little bit too much, so I'm going to try to, and I'm already doing it, to give this as quick as I can. So I wrote the things down to make sure that I would cover the things that I want to, and get them done quickly as I can. So I'm going to go back 48 years. So we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. But 48 years ago, I was married to another person. And so that's where I want to start to bring us up to date. That first marriage that I was in started out with deceit. I got a girl pregnant out of wedlock, and we tried to cover it up by saying when my daughter was born 8 months later, she was only at 5 pounds and a few ounces. And we said, well, she's premature. We got pregnant on our wedding night, and we figured everybody believed that. You know, nobody believed that. They really didn't. But we thought they did. We thought we had them fooled. So that's the excuse we used. And it was a lie that we told people. And our marriage was living on a lie. And because of that our marriage was like many years ago, the dam at Menno burst. And all the water ran down into the James River. What caused it was there was a breach at the bottom of that, just a small little trickle. And over the years, it got a little bit bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger. And all of a sudden, there was enough gone that the pressure from the water broke that dam and it burst. And that's kind of what happened in our marriage. Living on that lie, there was that breach in our marriage that never, ever really got plugged up and healed. Slowly eroding, and finally it burst. In our first marriage, we went to church, but we didn't live like godly lives during the week. We forgot a lot of the things, or I did, that I learned in Sunday school and church, Bible reading, sermons. Over the years, I knew these things, but we were not living that godly life. And by the 4th or 5th year of our marriage, our trust had been compromised. We had become deceitful, not to other people only, but to ourselves as well. And this deceitfulness led to unfaithfulness. And it came from both sides. And it wasn't just my first wife, but myself as well. And in the 7th year, I came home from work. The house was empty. Closets and dressers were empty. My wife and daughter were gone for 8 days. And on the 8th day, I got a letter in the mail from my ex-wife saying that she's in California. This is where she's going to be living now. And about an hour later, the county sheriff drove in and served me divorce papers. So that was quite an exhilarating day, to say the least. The 8th day, I found out where they were, and I was served with the divorce papers. It started the summer that I spiraled into a very deep depression. And I struggle with anxiety. I'm right now struggling with anxiety. It's one of the things that I deal with. And because of that, the knot that was in my stomach 24/7. I couldn't get it out of my head. I went to work with it. I got up and went to work with it, came home with it. I stopped sleeping too. I stopped sleeping, I stopped eating. And because of that, I went from 195 pounds down to 160 in 3 months. Not a good way to lose weight. And in the process, I got an ulcer. The nights turned to paranoia, where I would come home and I'd go to the whole house and look under the beds, in the closets, in the attic, every place to make sure that nobody was in the house, because I felt that maybe somebody was in there going to get me. And I spent the rest of the evening sitting in a big chair. I had a shotgun, rifle, and a pistol on my lap. Just in case they got close, I would use one or the other. If they were too far away, I would use the rifle. And that's the paranoia that took over. And the interesting thing I found out about those nights of sleeplessness, I had gotten this little New Testament Gideon Bible, and it's just about shot, but for some reason I found myself on those sleepless nights, and even I took this Bible to church, to work with me, and I started reading it when I'd have a few moments at work. And I started underlining verses, and I'm not even sure why. John 3:16, really? I memorized that, I underlined it. For God so loved the world. But the verses that, some of them that came up were like in James 3, where it says, "For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Submit yourself, therefore, to God, resist the devil." I read those things, underlined those things. They did not register in my head. I didn't understand that. I read those. But what it did was it set me up for one day at work. A friend at work told me about a group down in Yankton at Mount Marty called Beginning Experience, or BE, and I attended there for 9 weeks, and we shared stories in a group setting, about 6 or 8 people in a group. And I went in there with thinking that this story of mine is the worst story possible. Nobody could have a bad story as what I am going through. And then I heard the stories of some of the other women. And I say women because I think out of a group of 50, 60 people, there was only 5 guys maybe. Because the women are more easily to admit that they need help than guys do. So when I heard their stories, and I thought the mental and physical abuse that some of these women went through, I thought, mine looks like a cakewalk. And what it did for that 9 weeks then, after the small group sessions there, we ended up going to a 3-day retreat in Sioux Falls at O'Gorman High School. And when we got there, again, there was 50, 60, maybe 70 people. We went around the room counting, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then all the ones get together, you're in a group. All the threes get together. Well, guess what? Terrie was a number something, and I was the same number. We got in the same small group. And we were in a group of about 6 or 8 people. And we shared our stories. And I started hearing her story about how she was healed from the addiction that she had and delivered from that. And the more I heard about that, the redemption from that addiction, how God sent the Holy Spirit to minister to her, and she'll tell you a little bit more about that later, I found myself being attracted to her, not just for the looks, although I did at the end, I did notice her walk away. So I can't say that, I'm a guy. What can I say? All right? But the thing that got me interested, because I really didn't think I would trust women anymore. My mother was about the only one and she was questionable, that I would trust anymore. And
see what I live with?
Tell it like it is, yeah. So that's what really attracted me to her. And we were able then, we were not allowed to meet one-to-one. Only in the group setting, and then we're split up. We were not allowed to pair off. If we were, they would break us out of the group. So the very last day, the last meal, Terrie and I sat across from each other and shared a meal together and said some things to each other and talked about some things, other out of the group kind of things. And that led to 8 weeks where we had hours and hours and hours phone conversations, sometimes all night long. I wasn't sleeping anyway, so what difference does it make? So we talked sometimes till 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, till I went to work. And no cell phones, so when I got an $800 phone bill, I thought maybe we should do something different. And so, and a few dates later, we were getting to know more about each other, and Terrie will finish the story from where I leave this off, so go ahead.
My story is not much different than Ron's. When I was on, my second marriage was dissolving. Most of my relationships prior to or when I got married had to do with addiction, living outside of God's will, and domestic violence, and living a life that was very, very painful. And God had a way of getting me in a corner because he wanted to redeem me. I was in a treatment center one night because my former husband was going through treatment for his addiction, and I got to go to the family program. And during that program, the last night we were there, I was on my bed in the fetal position, and I was crying out to God. I said, I don't know who you are, what you are, but I want you in my life. I'd grown up in the church, not committed as a teenager, walking away. And I said that over and over, and God showed up. He came as a white light into my room, filled my room, and gave me peace, a peace I'd never, ever known before. And that peace propelled me to say, okay, God, whatever you want, I will do it to keep this peace and to know who you are. Well, then he gave me a vision of a slinky. And those of you that are old enough to know what metal slinkies are, know that they go sweetly down the stairs. Well, the Lord showed me the twisted slinky. And he said, Terrie, this is you. Your life is twisted, and you're trying to have relationships with other twisted slinkies. And it's never going to go down the stairs the way God intended it to do. And so he showed me the other things in my life that were unacceptable. He showed me that my son was going to be dedicated to him. Well, that son is now a pastor in Burlington, Wisconsin. If you want to put up the slide of our family. And he also showed me a picture of a cross with a light coming down and two people going around the bottom of that cross. Well, I thought that was going to be my former husband and I told him about the vision, saying we're going to have a spiritual marriage. And he said, Terrie, you're going to have to marry a preacher because it's not going to be me. I was brokenhearted. But it got to the point where he was driving with my son when he was drinking, and my son came home with some black and blue marks. And I said, God, I don't care. You said I'm going to have this spiritual marriage, but my child is more important. And so I filed for a divorce. I went to BE weekend. I was in AA, and my AA sponsor, what we call mentors, she said to me, Terrie, you need to go to BE. You've got to get some help for what you've been through, and you need to heal from your divorces. And so obedient as I was at that time, because I was so broken, I needed help. So I went to the BE 9 weeks, and then I went to the same weekend, and Ron and I, as he said, were in the same group. In the large group, before we broke up into small group, I remember looking around the room, and as he said, there weren't very many guys, and I had to case out each one. I don't like to say it, but I was not healed, and I was still looking for someone to fix me, and that was going to be a man. So I looked around the room, and I found something wrong with every one of them. And I looked over at Ron, and I said, I didn't know his name. I said, he's too skinny. And I said, good, because now I can work on me. I didn't have to play any games. I could look at my life and say, God, I need you to heal me. And he did. As we were in the small group, this guy I thought wasn't too attractive. All of a sudden, when I heard his story, how he loved his daughter, how he wasn't going to be in the bars like I had been, and he had loved his parents, his family, and he did a job for 8 years. I didn't know anybody that had a job for 8 years. So he was a form of stability for me, and all of a sudden he started looking really attractive. So as he talked about us dating, we were standing in my duplex in Sioux Falls one evening in the living room, and just holding each other. All of a sudden I felt this peace again, this blanket around us, this column, and I thought to myself, I couldn't tell who was Terrie and who was Ron. And from that moment, we started talking about getting married. And I believe now, in these years later, that was the Lord spiritually causing us to be one flesh. That he had a plan and a purpose, and that it was going to be, we would become that one flesh. And that was 40 years ago. And so he has fulfilled that dream in my heart that he gave when I got sober, that I would have a spiritual marriage. I don't recommend 8 weeks later being married, because I think we need to get your healing, a lot of things that can happen. But if God is in the middle of it, he will bring it to pass if we cooperate and we go alongside of him and say, I will do what you're asking me to do. If you'll put up the picture, the next slide is a picture of our home. We live on an acreage farm up in where Ron was raised. And 40 years we've been there. It's going to be hard to move. God's moving us into a different season, and we're both going, I don't know, I can't leave this. So we're going to go to the acrostic on your insert, and we're going to talk about the rose and what that means in a marriage. And the next slide, talking about the rose, is going to be about relationships. When I did my credentialing, I had to do an internship, and that was to learn how to perform a marriage service. And so when I was doing that, I got a little nervous because I had to be the one to do the message. And I started praying. I said, okay, Lord, what is it? What do you want me to say here? And he gave me a beautiful picture of a rose and a rope. And what that signified was, in a marriage, you can have the beauty and the fragrance of the rose petals, or you can have the thorns. And what happens in marriage is, if we don't take responsibility for our part in the marriage, we will feel those thorns. But if we are in unity and working with the Lord, we are going to have the beauty of the rose. If you look at the triangle up there, you have three things, or three people. I have to have a relationship with the Lord, has to be number one. And Ron and I had decided we were going to have the Lord in this marriage because we'd failed so miserably in the other ones. And then you have Ron and I on the bottom. I have to be responsible for my relationship with God. Ron can't do that. No one else can do that. That's my job. Ron has to take care of his own. And then the two of us with the Lord in the middle are going to have a very, very beautiful, long-lasting relationship. The rope signifies the boundaries around your marriage. When you get married, it's two becoming one. It isn't mom coming in there to help her daughter. It isn't a father who's lost his daughter to marriage for him to come in and put his information in. It's not about your work coming in and getting in that relationship. It's not about sports. It's not about any of those things coming in. Your responsibility is to keep the intruders out of your marriage. And you are the ones that need to take responsibility for that. If one of you as a spouse is getting jealous of what's going outside of the marriage because of work, friends, family members, there's going to be a jealousy that arises. And Jimmy Evans, in his marriage DVDs, talks about Jesus is jealous for our relationship, isn't he? He will not tolerate anyone else in our relationship that would come before him. And so that jealousy is natural in a marriage, as we are an example of Christ in the church. So if your spouse is having some jealousy, I hope you're listening to what they're saying, because they're telling you that someone else is getting their place in the marriage, and that is unacceptable to the Lord, and it hurts the marriage. So in that respect, you got to guard against the intruders that are coming into your marriage. All right, the next slide, please.
We live in a culture where the enemy is trying to confuse gender and the definition of marriage and actually change for his perverse use. As the body of Christ, it's our responsibility to uphold the biblical standards of marriage and gender. And I want to start out with Genesis 1:1, verses 26 to 28. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Verse 26, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. In verse 28, then God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And then in Genesis 2:24 to 25, it says, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, and the man and his wife were not ashamed. And the last one, if everybody can read that off of the screens ahead of us, let's read that together, 1 Corinthians 7:2, the congregation as well.
But because of the temptation to impurity and to avoid immorality, each man have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Let's not get confused about what our role is, men and women. God has called us to such a beautiful thing. And the reality is in Ephesians 5, you can all read that later, and we hear that preached at so many weddings and so many marriage workshops and seminars, that respect the husband, wives to respect the husbands, and the husbands cherish their wives. But why does he say that? Because we represent Christ in the church. And that is a powerful admonition that I don't think a lot of couples really understand the impact of what your marriage does in the culture. It's the first line of defense against the enemy. And it's that defense and that glory that we carry that is going to help transform our world and show the love of God for those that are broken. And so I hope and pray that you will understand the brevity of what your marriage does in our culture. We have the power to show the love of Christ through our marriages to transform our culture. Let's go to the next slide, and that for O is, the next slide, offense.
That is offense.
It is offense.
It is.
Anybody remember that picture, Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames? Well, many times in life, we think our husband or our spouse or wife is the bad guy. And I think of myself sometimes, I think I wear the black sometimes more than I wear the white. And so when I was doing ministry with Women at the Well for 8 years, we went around and we did drama, we did team building, women's conferences, and we had a motto that we used as our way of keeping the team bonded together. And what that was, if you want to fill in the blank, it says, give no offense. Give no offense. Take no offense. And when it comes, and it will, be quick to forgive. We are called in our marriages and any other place besides all our other relationships to give no offense, take no offense, and when it comes, be quick to forgive. All right, the next slide. As a teen, how many of you grew up with attitudes or behaviors or things that you aren't really proud of and that you haven't corrected yet? Well, when you bring those uncorrected behaviors or attitudes into your marriage, what does it cause? A lot of conflict. In my family as a teen, I learned the art of pouting, that I prided myself that in a family of 8, I could not talk to anybody for 3 days. Bad habit to bring into marriage. If you can't communicate your thoughts, your attitudes, your desires, your marriage is going to fall. When we got married, over the course of about 6 years, I was in therapy up in Sioux Falls because I needed to change. It had nothing to do with Ron. It had to do with my issues and things that I had been wounded in.
Yeah, I realized early in the relationship that I was not going to be everything to her. She needed certain things from other people other than what I was able to give to her. And part of the things that she brought into the marriage from previous marriages and home life was a little bit of anger that she had towards her dad. And occasionally that came out sideways and hit me. And there was times when I would say, I'm not the enemy here. I am not your dad. My name is Ron Fischer. And she says, you're right. You're not my dad. And she was projecting something onto me that wasn't mine to receive.
I encourage you, if you have issues in your marriage that are unresolved, get help. There's nothing wrong with visiting a pastor, getting therapy, even medication if you're finding out you're depressed or whatever. We have to humble ourselves. If we're going to have a healthy marriage, we need to work on our own issues. We need to put on your big girl pants and do what you got to do. Mark 3:25 says, similarly, a family splintered by feuding will fall apart. Somewhere down the line, if there's too much offense in a family, somebody disappears. They just go away because they're tired of the fighting. They're tired of people not taking responsibility. When we talked about the boundaries, I highly recommend Boundaries in Marriage by Cloud and Townsend. In there it talked about boundaries and what do the 3 things you need in those boundaries. Everyone needs freedom. Freedom to be who you are. I have never been so free in a relationship until Ron and I got married, and I could be who I need to be. He's not afraid to be who he is and have his ideas and thoughts. The other thing we need is responsibility. I just said it. I have to take responsibility for me, and he has to for himself. And the final thing is when we have freedom and responsibility, we have love. Because I take responsibility for the things, and I apologize. I say, I shouldn't have done that, and God can heal. But if you're not going to take responsibility, if you need treatment, if you need counseling, whatever is necessary, we need to do that. And then Matthew 24. I'm not going to read it because I don't want to run out of time here, but how are you going to build your house? If you build it on the rock of Jesus Christ, you are going to have fruit. If you build it on sand, again, someone is going to leave the relationship because of the abuse. Yes,
and one of the things that I learned, especially from the first marriage, is when we had a good old knockdown discussion, and I call it an argument or fight, we didn't really apologize afterwards. We just let it kind of fizzle out, let a day or two or a week go by, and just sweep it under the rug. And when we got married, the first thing we learned in BE was how to forgive. And the 6 words that I'll use here and probably a couple more times on this is, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And it sounds simple, but when I want to be right instead of well, then I don't want to give that up. My pride says don't. But what it does then, it frees me up to say, will you forgive me? Yes.
Next slide talks about anger, and this verse and the next one in James, the Lord has used with me many, many times. When we first got married and hadn't had things figured out to ways to communicate, I would go to bed angry. And having read the book of James many, many times, it says, don't let the sun go down in your anger. And the Lord would speak to me, don't let the sun go down in your anger. And I go, I don't want to get up. I don't want to go do anything about this. Well, I would get up. I had to obey because I wanted a good marriage. And so I get up, and we may not have resolved it that night, but we agreed that we would work on it and say, I'm sorry, let's change, let's do something about this. And the same thing in verse 20 of James there, it says, for man's anger does not promote the righteousness of God. I wanted whatever God had for me. I wanted his righteousness in my life. And so again, when that would come up, you're not working God's righteousness, Terrie.
One of the sayings that I have used time and time again over my life and in our marriage and other places, it's better to sleep on what I was thinking of saying or doing than to lose sleep over what I just said and what I've just done. It's much easier to fall asleep thinking, but not having to go and apologize and do all of that as later.
Let's look at 1 Corinthians 13, 4-6, and let's read that together.
Love is patient. Love is kind.
It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking, not easily angered. It keeps no records of wrongs. Amen. So we talked about the key to forgiveness, and this verse, Pastor spoke about salvation message in the beginning of with the child dedication. Each of us has to make that choice, and that comes to surrendering our hearts to Christ and moving into what He has for us in every relationship, just not our marriages. The next slide talks about, I've told you these things so that you may have perfect peace and confidence. In the world you have tribulation and trials and distress and frustration, but be of good cheer. Take courage. Be confident, certain, undaunted, for I have overcome the world. I've deprived it of its power to harm you, and have conquered it for you. We get into magical, mystical thinking. When I first came to the Lord, I thought, nothing's going to, I've gotten saved. All of a sudden, things of the past are gone, and I'm going to be great. That's not reality. And anybody sitting here who has that magical, mystical thinking, pretty soon you're going to run into a wall, and you're going to have trials and tribulations. And so forgiveness is our way of dealing with that in our marriages. And there's going to be things that hit us. Next slide, please. In sickness and in health, here's our trials and tribulations, were some of them that we faced. Oh, Ron?
I had a hard time getting to the house that day and opened the door to yell in, Terrie, I need help. And a trip to ER. And we've had several of those over these 40 years, both of us. Me more than her. I'm one of these kind of guys that says, hey, watch this, and I paid the price sometimes. So we were there for each other when that sickness or accident happened.
So let's go to the next slide. What is the S in the rose? Well, this is a proverbial thing that happens in marriage. What does sex look like? So, again, our past behaviors brought in issues, and those impact us in the marriage bed. In Hebrews, it says, marriage should be held in honor, especially esteemed and worthy, precious of great price, and especially dear in all things. And thus let the marriage bed be undefiled, kept dishonored, for God will judge and punish the unchaste, all guilty of sexual vice and adulteress.
And in Proverbs 5:15-17, drink waters out of your own cistern of a pure marriage relationship, and fresh waters, running waters, out of your own well. Okay, guys, I don't think we need to explain that. You got your own cistern, get your own water. You don't go over to the neighbor and look in their well or their cistern. You've got your own well and your running water at home. Should your offspring be dispersed abroad as water brooks in the street, confine yourself to your own wife. Let your fountain of human life be blessed with the rewards of fidelity, and rejoice in the wife of your youth. And one other thing, quick thing there, is that, guys, when you notice that I haven't changed much from those first slides when we got married back in '83. Maybe the color of the hair got a little bit different. But when Terrie looks in the mirror, I use the same mirror when I look in the mirror. So if you're thinking, wow, she's really changed a lot over 40 years. Well, I use the same mirror. Guess what? I've changed a lot. I feel blessed and fortunate that she still looks at me and wants to come home with me after the dance, whenever we go dancing.
We don't go dancing.
No, we don't go dancing. All right. Yeah.
But if you look at that verse in 16, it said, should your offspring be dispersed abroad? How many children do we have out here in our culture without fathers? Because we have not taken responsibility sexually in our culture to give children a safe place to live and to grow within a marriage and within a family. So let's all read the bottom, Colossians 3:5. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Paul is admonishing us that we need to put those to death. If we get into magical, mystical thinking and not be intentional, they aren't going to go away. That's our responsibility as believers in Christ. The next slide talks about why did God create sex? Well, obviously, procreation. He said, be fruitful and multiply. And he had a plan and a purpose for sex, and it's intended to be beautiful, fulfilling, and very rewarding. And as I said, it's for pleasure. Obviously, many of you, your kids are grown, and you're still having a good time at home, right? So, we are. I hope you are. Sorry. It's supposed to be that way.
Yeah, it is.
But we read the verse, keep the marriage bed undefiled. And this is serious. How do we defile our marriages? And it says in that verse it has to do with sexual immorality. But there's also issues that defile our marriage where it stops us from entering into that intimacy. And let's talk about physical, verbal, sexual, mental, and emotional abuse that's happening in our family. It's rampant. And many of us don't even see it because it's like a frog in the boiling water. You start with it warm, and then pretty soon it escalates. And all of a sudden you're in a full-blown divorce because of not taking care of those issues. I've worked with many abused women over the years with counseling and in recovery, and there's a really good resource on the sheet that is available, and it's about identifying whether you're in an abusive relationship. Men are not the only abusers. Women are very good at abusing their husbands, demeaning them, not respecting them. What are the words you're using? Are you encouraging? Are you uplifting? Are you, honoring one another and esteeming each other? Another abuse I talked to this earlier about is addiction. If the thing that you're addicted to becomes the idol in your marriage, you've abandoned your spouse. Do what you need to do to take care of that. Get into treatment, get into therapy, whatever it takes. If you love your spouse, you need to do something about that. Old relationships. If you've had partners before your marriage, it's not uncommon for you to have those images in your head. So when you're having sex, you need to be thinking about who your spouse is. Those are the images that you need to have in your mind. And there again, cast those things out. Ask Jesus to help you to heal those issues. Romance novels. How about Hallmark movies? How about fantasizing? Our mind and our thoughts need to be on our spouse. There is no room in our marriage. In those boundaries, those are intruders in your marriage, and you need to be responsible for those. Watching other movies or series of movies, all of a sudden, that guy looks really good. And all of a sudden, we're discontented with what we've really been given, which is a gift. A friend of ours in recovery, she was going to the gym. Then they were having some struggles in the marriage, and she was fantasizing about this guy that was working out. It didn't take very long before she was having an affair with him. And by the grace of God, forgiveness took place, and their marriage has been restored. Let's go to the next slide.
I guess I thought when we came to France, you wouldn't still be, like you. And sometimes this goes along with being content in our marriage. Just because you go someplace and you have this fantasy, I thought if we would go here, that maybe you would be somebody different. But guess what? That person has the same personality, and just going to some place and expecting that to happen does not necessarily happen.
Geographical cures do not work.
Yeah, no.
Finding another spouse doesn't work because you're going to have to go through the same work that you're doing now. The next slide. So you can either feel the thorns or you can feel the fragrance of the rose. Till death do you part. That was 10 years ago. We renewed our vows at our farm. And Ron and I got married in the security center down here.
Safety center.
Safety center 40 years ago. We'd both had weddings before, and we decided, no, God's in it, so we're going to do it at the safety center. It was a very meaningful time. But we decided 10 years ago, I want to have a wedding. And we had a beautiful time with our family on that day. So if you want for happy ever after, you got to be intentionally building your marriage. So we're going to go to E in the acrostic for the rose, enjoying. I believe this is probably my most favorite time of our marriage. We've gone through different seasons of first being married. We didn't have the privilege of not having children because we brought children into our marriage. Spent all those years raising our kids, being busy, but we still invested in our marriage, doing things that were going to strengthen us. We walked down our gravel road, I don't know how many times. Crises would come, and the kids would be busy, and we'd go walk the road. We had to talk. We had to work things out. And so the thing that we have in this part of our marriage, we've worked through a lot of the difficult things. Now when I feel like I've overstepped my bounds and said something I shouldn't, I mean, there's a pain in my heart. I got to go apologize. I don't want this between us. He's the same way. And so as you've invested and you've worked and you've built this marriage, there is such rewards for it. Go ahead.
Yeah, this slide also talks about common interests. Terrie was an urban girl. She spent her 9 weeks BE in Sioux Falls. I was on a farm, raised in a rural community. So I came down here to Yankton. So when we got married, one of us had to move. So she ended up moving down to the farm and had to adapt to that. And she did that quickly. Learned to love the farm, natural things out in nature. And so when spring comes along and the birds that are migrating through, one of the common interests we have is, hey, come here, look, this bird just came in again, and we maybe get to see it for one time, and we happen to look out the window at that exact time, and we don't see him again. Or I say, let's go take a drive around the river and see what, the deer, something like that. Campfires, going camping. It's something we both really like to do. We have common interests, and it keeps us and our marriage alive.
Would you show the video, please?
What guy wouldn't follow that scream off of my... We were 6,500 feet when we took off from that mountain launching pad, and then we went up another 1,000 feet into the clouds, and we couldn't even see each other. We just were communicating. Our pilots
we
were...
had to talk, so
we had to
wouldn't
talk,
bump into each
run
other.
into each other. And it's like Terrie and another gal had gone on a mission trip down to Mexico, Valle de Bravo. So we finally got to go together down there, and she had already done this by herself. And I said, wow, I've done hang gliding before, but this is really cool. So back in the days before, and I said, watch this. I really wanted to take that risk with her. It was fun, and the other risk was I had to stand up in front of a church that the only Spanish I know was por favor, and that came from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid movie. I didn't know any Spanish, had to use an interpreter. I've never done that before. So that was a risk that was, so when these people are down in El Salvador, it's amazing that there's a common language with Jesus. and even if you have to go through an interpreter. But that was a risk for me, and I took it.
And I risked coming to the farm, and I don't regret it. The next slide, when it talked about retreats, when we first got married, we had no clue how to put a blended family together. And our culture is full of blended families and wonderful resources out there. And we were invited to a retreat for blended families. And it was powerful. It showed the dynamics of what we were going to have to face. And on your resource list, there's a book called Blended and Redeemed. I highly recommend it to help you navigate if you're in court, custody, different things like that, to help you make a smooth transition in your family. Okay, the next slide is on Psalm 16:11. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures evermore. This is a day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you, by the power of Holy Spirit, you may abound in hope. Hopefully you've heard some things in our story that give you hope. We all have trials and tribulations. We all have areas that we need to change. But we're sitting here 40 years later, after all the trauma, after all the sin, after all the things that we had walked through. God has redeemed it. We are happy. We are joyful. And I just give you the next slide is, there's our happiness, the different things that we have done that we enjoy together. And then there's another slide, why don't you go to the next one?
The retreats we went on, sometimes we would say, where are we going anyway? Do we have any plans? What are our goals? And we tried to do that at home, but then, of course, when you're home, you say, well, maybe let's take a break. I'll go out and mow for a while. Then I don't come back in. We didn't get accomplished. So what we did is we would go someplace, whether it's a campsite down here at Yankton or if we went to a motel for
next
over
slide, please.
the weekend. Okay,
Yeah.
Next slide.
Go ahead.
Okay, the couples retreat. I was going to say something about entering the middle because...
I'm tired of waiting for you.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding.
Okay. This is really how we get along. It reminds me of her looking at the map, and I'm driving. I really don't know where I'm going, but, we're going nowhere, and we're entering the middle. And she says, this is just going from getting worse to worst. So, we needed to make decisions.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in 2006, this resource came to us, and it's been crucial for us. We take time to get away, and we process these questions. And one of them is, what did you like this year? What didn't you like? Well, we journaled. We wrote about all the things that we said. We set goals. And that's become a habit of ours now because it helps us focus about our family, our finances, our kids. And we sit there and we pray, we talk about it, and we know God is in the middle of it. So we're moving forward in God's plan for us. And so I highly recommend that for you as couples, if you're feeling that, what are we doing? Where are we going? And realize that God has a plan to get you there. And it can be with joy, with peace, and excitement.